Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and it's very nice to be around well-known faces and friends to also see you on the screen. So you're doing a project and you specialize in the assistance of migrant women and girls who are victims of trafficking, and I'm very thankful to the last presentation. It was very useful to hear it all together. What I will do is speak about the EU level, a broader level, and do this and maybe put the project in another context. I also see that the EU network of migrant women is speaking about the EU level, so hopefully the presentations will complement each other. Of course, my mandate is completed. I don't represent the Commission, and I'm here to speak in my personal capacity. I think I have been able to have this privileged view of all the member states, both detailed and broader. So I'll base what I say on the last 9 years of this experience. You are aware of the situation at the EU level. There's been a number of reports that have come out. There's been a recent progress report and a data report, which I also had a look at as a citizen. So it's almost getting too repetitive to say that women and girls are the vast majority of the victims, with trafficking for sexual exploitation being the main form. This is a pattern that is clear and consistent across the EU. What is not clear to many is why some actors are desperate to prove the opposite and to drive attention away from sexual exploitation, despite all attempts to prove the opposite. And what is not clear is who drives this, who is behind it. So personally, to me, today's event is especially welcome. We need to keep this visible, and we need to keep the victims of this form of exploitation visible. Of course, women and girls are trafficked for labor exploitation, for forced begging, for forced marriage, for organ trafficking, to engage in criminal activities, for domestic servitude. But let us not forget that trafficking for sexual exploitation, its victims are 95% women and girls. So the gender dimension is crystal clear. We must not shy away from acknowledging this, that there are structural differences. In fact, it's not just a responsibility, it is a moral duty, I would say, to make them visible. So I will start by saying what I always say, and I think is catching on a little bit. Trafficking continues to be based on the same laws of supply and demand. These are the economic principles behind profit. So if we divert attention to other factors, that like ethnopolitical conflict, like poverty, like inequalities, we fail to directly address the issue at stake. And I've said it many times, all these factors of course make victims extremely vulnerable, but they do not cause trafficking. You know, these factors do not make a man rape a woman or a girl. Some just appear to be willing and indeed eager to exploit vulnerable people for the sake of substantial profit, cheap products, cheap and easy sexual abuse. And often they know so. So during my mandate, I explicitly tried to ensure that the gender dimension of trafficking was fully acknowledged and taken into consideration in measures we took at the EU level. And this project has been a good opportunity for me to reflect a little bit on that. So what has been done? We had quite a groundbreaking study in cooperation with Lancaster University, which I would urge you to read, and which analyzed the gender dimension of the crime. And this has fed into the policy priorities of the Commission that were adopted at the end of 2017. They're still valid, and where gender is mainstreamed throughout the document. We also had a report by the European Institute of Gender and Gender Equality on the specific gender-specific measures in anti-trafficking action as these relate to the 2011 Directive. And I'm sure you're very well aware of that. We had a guide on child trafficking with focus on girls in the Fundamental Rights Agency. We ensured, I think that's the most important thing we've done, funding targeted specifically for NGOs and member states to work on trafficking of women and girls, especially on sexual exploitation and on the gender dimension of the crime. We ensured gender-specific programming on trafficking across the EU services. We mainstream trafficking for sexual exploitation of women and girls in Commission documents, policies, legislative proposals. We also found in a policy review of all the anti-trafficking projects ever funded by the Commission from 2004 to 2015, it was a huge exercise, that projects on labor exploitation received twice the funding than projects on sexual exploitation. In fact, most of them were before I was around. And a fraction goes to projects on trafficking for sexual exploitation. 2% go to projects specifically on women and girls. So what I've tried to do is to address that. What we have not seen, even though we made this public, I kept talking about it, is civil society formally expressing any concerns about this. Even if trafficking for sexual exploitation has been sidelined in terms of law enforcement efforts, because it has been, awareness raising activities, even political will in some cases, we still find that the victims are women and girls. We find what we look for. This is what a police officer told us. But really, I say we cannot hide what is there. So, of course, we ensure that trafficking is fully addressed in external policies, in programming, including the Spotlight Initiative is €500 million. And we ensure that one of the 5 strands is on trafficking. The EU Civil Society platform on trafficking, some of you are part of this, consists of maybe, I would say 1/4 of the whole platform is women's rights organization specializing on the gender dimension. In 2013, I said, and some people were very unhappy, I said publicly on behalf of the European Commission that trafficking explicitly is violence against women and girls. This is in line with Article 6 of CEDAW. Of course, at the EU level, we also had explicit European Parliament resolutions, fantastic ones, dating back from 2016 and ongoing. I will specifically mention the Parliament resolution on sexual exploitation and prostitution and its impact on gender equality. It has asked us to do a number of things and to act, and I think we should all be accountable and look at those recommendations. Victims of trafficking for all forms of exploitation are exploited in multiple sectors, but prostitution is the highest risk sector. Of course, we know that not all people in prostitution are victims of trafficking, but what a senior member of the German police said in public is that victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation are always exploited in the prostitution and the sex industry. And apparently this is a sensitive issue. I don't think it's a sensitive issue. I think it's a clear-cut issue and that we have to address it. We have to, and what I see is an extremely worrying trend to shy away from talking about this. I'm talking about the broader level. Trafficking for sexual exploitation is not, it does not appear, this is politically correct terms, is not a priority for many international actors and member states alike in the last 10 years. If you do a little research, you will see this. I hope that the trend is shifting and I hope that we contributed to this. In fact, what is a concern of mine, and that relates very much to assistance of victims, is that often this tendency to deprioritize trafficking for sexual exploitation results in the normalization of the crime. And in fact, I have said this in the Commission's second progress report that I drafted. I also urge you, and I'm very conscious of your work and very respectful, and I admire your work, but we have to make sure that we decouple migrant smuggling from trafficking. Of course, they're interlinked sometimes, but they're very different phenomena. We can discuss this at length, legally and operationally. And the problem is that if we don't decouple, we run the risk to have detrimental consequences for the victims. I will not elaborate on this, but we have to keep this in mind. Having said that, migrant women and girls have very specific needs for assistance, and this is clear. And this is why projects such as this one is extremely valuable. What I think we need to focus on is the law, and to focus on the implementation of the law. Maybe in Ireland this is less relevant, but I will say why it is still very relevant. We know that Article 18 member states have of the EU Directive, member states have a legal obligation to discourage and reduce the demand and raise awareness of the phenomenon. it obliges member states to take appropriate action, not civil society, member states, to take action to inform and raise the awareness around the issue of demand and to promote trainings, etc., etc. The question we need to be asking, is this done? And if not so, why? Back when I was still in charge of this policy area, in 2016, we did a report on the criminalization of users of services of victims of trafficking. And it was very clear that we do need legislation across the EU. The Commissioner for Home Affairs 1 year ago announced that there will be a legislative proposal on this. And I think that that would be extremely useful and extremely important. I'm saying that because often we hear from experts such as you that of course legislation matters a great deal, but it's very hard when the legislation is so different from one member state to the other. Now, another question. The Employer Sanctions Directive, that you must be very aware of, from 2009, I think, criminalizes those employers who use the services and work of victims of trafficking that are illegally staying non-EU nationals. It doesn't cover victims of trafficking who are EU nationals. So I have another question. Why is this so? The EU directive itself on trafficking from 2011 obliges the member states, to ensure liability of legal persons and sanctions for legal persons involved in the crime, including when lack of supervision and control has been made possible. So another question I have, is this done by the member states? This is extremely important. So, of course, we have multiple instruments that have been adopted to ensure accountability in extremely complex cases and criminalization. But listen to this. In many cases, we get incomprehensibly frozen when the perpetrator has used the services of the victim of trafficking for sexual exploitation, approaching a girl half naked, alone in the street in the winter. We've seen it many times. Why? Why do we get frozen? Why is there nothing done? Some people say because of it's very hard to prove the knowledge, blah, blah. We know, I don't give you all the background because you all know the background. Why do we need the knowledge part? The answer is political, not legal. I have spoken to many prosecutors across the EU at the highest level. This comes from them. Of course, it's difficult, but any crime is hard to prove. And it gets as hard as any other crime that is already in the criminal code. And unfortunately or fortunately, I'm old enough to be talking about the same thing that we talked about 30 years ago when it came to rape throughout the EU. Same arguments, same discussion. Is this where we are at? So here's my messages. And I think that as very active members of civil society, very influential organizations that we have around the table, it's very important to focus on some of these recommendations, if I like. First of all, to focus on the fact that there is no need for additional legal instruments on trafficking per se, or changes in the definitions of the crime regionally or internationally. I'm saying this because I have witnessed firsthand efforts to challenge the Palermo Protocol and the Council of Europe Convention. That would be completely...
Okay. Myria, we are back online. That was...
Technical issues, okay, but I hope I can continue. I had finished the first part of my presentation, and thank you to Mr. O'Brien for the space and for coming in earlier. So I will just focus now on some recommendations that I have based on the messages that I tried to convey before. So I will just repeat the first one so that there is some flow in the conversation. First of all, I think it's very important that we ensure that there are no additional legal instruments on trafficking per se, or any changes in the definitions of the crime, regionally or internationally. I have witnessed this personally, efforts to challenge Palermo and the Council of Europe Convention. And I think what is urgent for you as civil society and for all our member states, for all of us, is to ensure the ratification and correct implementation of existing legal instruments, whether it's the Palermo, whether it's the Council of Europe Convention, and of course the EU Directive. We have definitions and concepts that are very clear, and we should insist on using them. Also, I think that while we don't need a new legal instrument on trafficking, we need legal instruments urgently to complement the current legal framework at the EU level. I'm always referring to the EU level, and to criminalize the use of a victim of trafficking. And what is very important here, because some member states have been criticizing, has been criticized for having criminalized one form of exploitation, the use of the victim of one form. I think this is correct. I think that all forms of exploitation cannot and must not be treated in the same manner. Forms of exploitation vary, and criminal proposals must address this. So basically, and I've said this before, paying for forced sex, I mean raping a woman, is not the same as paying for strawberries by the street side. So of course we need different legislation. And we have some very good legal steps, and I would argue that Ireland is one of these good cases. But of course, the law is one thing. Implementation is quite another, and I'm talking about the EU level now. The problem is not always the law. The problem is political and the willingness to implement the law. I have seen some of the questions from panelists, and I think that my intervention will basically respond to that. We must start with the criminalization of users of services of trafficking for sexual exploitation at the EU level. We need it at the EU level, otherwise it will have little effect at the national level. And listen to why. First of all, it's a main form of exploitation, but also because the user comes into direct, physical, and intimate contact with the victim. So the way to do this is crystal clear, and it's easy. And we have examples, such as Ireland, that we can use. All this is achievable. And I am sure at this stage that the obstacles are not legal or moral. Worryingly, they seem to lie on financial and therefore political motivations. And I hope this answers to the questions from the anonymous participant. It is regrettable to have to admit that despite all our efforts, and all of you have made immense efforts over the years, and all of the successes we've had, because all of us have had a number of successes, and we should be proud of that. But the crime doesn't seem to be diminishing. And for me, it's very clear now, 10 years later, why this is so. The political will to reduce the phenomenon is far from where it should be. I'm not talking about ticking boxes or PowerPoint presentations or paying lip service, but to actually wanting to change things. There are obvious systematic efforts by various stakeholders with clear vested, financial basically, interest to normalize the crime. I hope I'm replying to the questions now. We know the reasons why. For organized crime to thrive, we always like to say, oh, there's the criminals and the perpetrators. No, there are gaps in the legal environment. If you want to stop trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation and labor exploitation, we must focus more on the legal economy and structures. So the reason we're failing is not because civil society is not doing enough. It's not because the civil service is not doing enough. It's because behind the victims, there is money, corruption, and exploitation. And sometimes the passive complicity of political actors, some political actors. Any criminal justice approach that treats trafficking in a manner of, the trafficker and the victim will fail, because it fails to address the driving forces, which is the profits and the exploitation. So you can talk about the criminal, you can talk about the victim, but the elephant in the room is the money and the exploiter. So, and this is also what makes it a very gender-specific crime. And so we fail if we fail to focus on the fact that, especially when we talk about trafficking for sexual exploitation, we are referring to women and girls. It's not trafficking in persons. It's not trafficking in human beings. It's trafficking for sexual exploitation for women and girls. So we cannot hide behind vulnerabilities. We cannot eradicate world poverty, unfortunately, not now. So really, by focusing so much on vulnerabilities, I dare say that it's almost like putting the blame on the victims in a way. Let's put the focus back on the perpetrators, but also the profit makers in the legal economy too, who profits from that. That I saw in the screen before, I apologize for not being able to listen to our panelists, the previous panelists, but the audio was not working. But I saw the PowerPoint, 650 advertisements online. The advertiser is illegal. Who makes money out of this? So the profit makers, the exploiters, the users, the rapists. These are the people who cause the trafficking. So for as long as we allow them to remain unpunished, for as long as we allow this culture of impunity to reign because of financial and political interests, we are failing each and every victim. And then we are here doing all the fantastic work that you do and try to assist them. But it's a little bit like end of life care. We shouldn't come to that. How about preventive care? How about stopping it before it happens? Which one of us would feel comfortable if a person that we know was raped 5,000 times and then we provide assistance? Of course we will provide assistance, but what good are we at this stage? Of course we need to do that. And civil society has come a long way with a lot of success. But my strong advice is that every time you help a victim, you assist a victim, and you do that with so much dignity and respect, think of who has exploited the victim and who has profited, and ask the questions while you're assisting the victim. Otherwise, we cannot continue. Thank you very much.